In this episode, the path to modernism. Why does the Bauhaus still rule today? Welcome to Two Architects and a Lawyer. Join architect Luis de Miguel in Valencia and architect-lawyer William McLean in Vancouver for observations and commentary on all things design. Here are William and Luis in part 2 of their conversation.
I want to pull you back, Louis, to the Bauhaus here, because that's the spine of this conversation. What I have not heard you mention, and what I haven't mentioned at all, is the allied arts to architecture. Our conversation is focused on the building outcome of that movement. But of course, the Bauhaus single-handedly invented a few professions that didn't really exist before. The industrial designer, the graphic designer, those were not pursuits which were had particular importance, and they continue to have importance to today. And they, in those two professions, the Bauhaus has never lost its significance. And again, what we have not talked about is the great achievements of the Bauhaus in things like typography, in furniture design, in graphic design generally, in weaving, in color theory.
Yes.
All of those things were very modern and unheard of until the Bauhaus changed things so radically. As I said in the outset, we're confronted with the results of that philosophy every day with the things that surround us, and quite comfortably so. Prior to the Bauhaus, I suppose the schools of architecture were, well, the big one was the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. That was the model for schools everywhere, including in America. The method of teaching architecture and allied arts at the École des Beaux-Arts was to copy the classics, to learn from Greek and Roman architecture by sketching, by measuring, by reproducing, and attempting to use those precedents in modern projects. There was very little attention to experimenting with new materials, new techniques, which were coming along, of course, at the same time as the Bauhaus. So those two things are not independent. But we are left, as a result of the Bauhaus, with a universal approach to an understanding of what is attractive and desirable.
Well, they even got involved in textile design and in fashion. So, yes, I think what happened was, and this was a very short period in the life of architecture, where the architect, by being an architect, could actually design anything. And I think that era, the architect really thought, and I think you and I proved it, that yes, we could do it. There was not much difference between designing a logo and designing an entrance or an extension to a house or whatever. Now, the question is, what approach do you take when you're confronted with a problem, a design problem?
Well, again, looking back at the way the Bauhaus taught it, just to take drawing for one example, Johann Seyton was the master of drawing in the early days of Gropius's tenure at the Bauhaus, and he taught students to draw by telling them they had to stand and roar and feel color through their gestures and not draw what they saw necessarily, but draw what they felt. And this was a very novel concept, to the point where it scared the living daylights out of the locals, because there appeared to be a pack of crazies in this school. That's very different from the École des Beaux-Arts idea that we were talking about a minute ago, where you created by carefully copying the masters and patiently learned the techniques, and gave rise to modernism. I suppose the movement that we think of, we don't think of the Bauhaus movement, we think of modernism generally. It's the one we're most comfortable with because we were educated in it, we practiced in it, and we continue to admire it. To my sensibility, modernism, and by that I'm talking about what happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s in architecture, graphic design, industrial design, that's still the era that I'm most attracted to, that I find most perfect. Something has happened with the digital era, which has unsettled that progress of modernism, and I'm not sure where we're going. You've sent me images of fantasy architecture, which of course artificial intelligence is able to generate readily. It's a dystopian kind of view of the future, and it's hard to connect that back to the modernist ideals that arose from the
No, I
Bauhaus.
mean, you're right. Yeah, there's two things to look at here. One is the fact that when it comes to really important buildings, and the important buildings in our society are either churches or some kind of seat of government building, and of course the bank. And those buildings were still, until very recently, housed in very classical looking edifices, right? I mean, the whole idea of, solid stone for a bank, solid stone for, a parliament and so on, and copying all the Greek and Roman things, and everything had to have a dome. So that's one thing. And now that is, obviously it's changed. But and my problem with modernism is that you can parachute me in any city. I really can't tell you where I am. All the buildings look the same. I think that's a terrible thing. And somebody did say that not only less is more, but somebody said, well, yeah, but less is a bore. I kind of agree. I think the first, Lever House, Seagram, yeah, those are fantastic buildings. And they were groundbreaking and thank goodness for that. But did everybody have to make exactly the same building from here to Taiwan? I mean, honestly. So you look at what Zaha Hadid was doing or is doing, because her studio keeps going, and the very curvy stuff, and just really amazing things. And yet the software and the ability to draw really amazing things is extraordinary. But I think you have to have the imagination. I don't care. You can give a chisel and a hammer to somebody; they're not going to come up with a Dave.
Well, I the buildings that you've just mentioned, the buildings that are the result of not only computer imaging software, but computer building software. I think that was, just as a diversion here, that was something that Frank Gehry's office, as I understand it, realized at an early stage. There had been computer methods of visualizing architecture and with rendering and so forth. The big discovery that Gehry made was that software in, for example, the aeronautic industry was being used for construction, not simply visualization. Visualization was not significant when you're designing a plane. What was important was establishing machines' ability to withstand the stresses of air travel in that case, and furthermore, to guide you as to how to build the thing eventually. So he was able to use visualization software to become a construction software and allow him to create buildings that were otherwise unconceived of. And I think Zaha Hadid has continued that process. But from my personal point of view, and perhaps I'm an old fogey, but if none of those buildings, if Bilbao did not exist, if none of the curviness and strangeness that software imaging and building software has permitted, none of those things existed, I would be quite happy if we continued with the international style.
Oh, really?
And buildings were full of that in a developing normal way. I think that when you think about the international style, you talked some time ago about why it's so prevalent. You mentioned money and economy. Of course, the building techniques that are available to the developer today are a choice of either a steel frame or a concrete frame. You make that choice based on the current economy, and then you have to hang something on the outside which encloses it. The net result is going to be fairly predictable. And this combined with modernism, which suggests that minimalism is not only acceptable but desirable, tends to suggest the final result. The decisions that you make as a designer are not tremendously complicated. But maybe it's a con job. Maybe this idea of minimalism is something we've bought into because of the marketing angle. But it's something we should have resisted earlier and not accepted as a society. Um, uh,
Well,
and if we had revolted against it, which we did not, but if we had revolted against it, we'd be in a different place today. And I don't think it would be in the Frank Gehry Bilbao end of things. We would be in some other place.
well, I don't know where we'd be, because the problem with architecture in general is that, the best buildings ever built were pretty much going back to the Parthenon. Parthenon, the Colosseum.
You say that, but
Yeah, of course I
yeah, but
say
you
that because
say that,
it's
but that's
true. Because you look at the row houses in London, in the Victorian, the Edwardian, they're magnificent little buildings, and they understood that by making all of them the same, it looks like you live in a mansion, but you only have like one little slice of the pie. But yours, but it's a beautiful, it's just beautiful. And you look at a lot of the houses in suburbia, and they're ghastly. And most architects live in very old buildings because they have something that new buildings just don't have: harmony, beauty, organization. I mean, it's fantastic.
I'm glad you used that word beauty. Beauty is not something that has come up at all in this conversation, and it's a very difficult concept. But we've somehow been conned, I think, into thinking that beauty isn't something that we're entitled to. Shouldn't we be, as a society, in a position to demand beauty in the building that takes place
No,
around
but we're
us,
constantly demanding
and agree
it.
on what
Yeah,
that?
but when it comes to cars, when it comes to clothing, when it comes to, I mean, even food has to look magnificent. And basically,
Yes, but
yeah, I know what your point is.
my point is that the public isn't in a position to create that beauty or cause it to happen. They have to take what professionals are giving them, and professionals have to convince themselves that minimalism is, or eccentricism is, the way to
No, the only
deal
the
with
only
the
luxury.
demands of design.
The thing was that the trade-off between magnificent, beautiful, classical buildings and new, boxes in suburbia, what you were gaining there and the luxury were not the doodads and the details and the capitals and so on. What was space? What you were getting is space. And you see that with the success of loft. The idea of a loft with no column, or even with columns, but lots of space, no walls. No walls. The sensation of space, that is the ultimate luxury, in my humble opinion. And that you can give because you can span whatever you want. I mean, the Barcelona Pavilion, I'll just tell you something, because I bring up these little anecdotes, but most people don't look at things properly. But the Barcelona Pavilion, which is probably one of the most exquisite buildings ever, as modernist as you like, has columns that, in order to make them disappear, the guy, instead of making a square column, he used 4 L's and stuck them together, and that was the column. Not only that wasn't enough.
And by the guy, of course, you're talking about Mies
Yes,
van
of
der Rohe.
course, the guy. And the thing is that it wasn't enough. He coated them with polished chrome so that they would kind of disappear by reflecting everything. You know, they would go away. Mind you, because he was a mason at heart, he knew he had all the. Have you looked at that building? All the joints coming to these well, there's 8 columns, and all the joints of the flooring, the travertine, are lined up with the centers of those columns. I mean, it's poetry in motion. Well, then he had the flying roof over the building, and he wanted to do the concrete. He wanted slab, and they said, no, slabs, it's too heavy. So what they did was they made a steel roof, and they gave it some depth, and then the thing was finished in cement to make it appear like a slab. But they're not actual concrete slabs. They're steel roof. So, sometimes you have to dig a little deep, because you are being sold a bag of tricks.
Well, that building, as I understand it, was initially the German pavilion. Was it a Barcelona World's Fair?
Yes, it was a World's Fair.
Yes, and it was the German pavilion. But so there's a political element here, as there so often is in anything to do with design. I think that obviously something that happens at World's Fairs is that countries want to project a national image, which is special, important, and superior. I'm not sure what Mies van der Rohe's marching orders were and why they changed, because the German pavilion moniker has quickly disappeared. So something was happening politically at the time the building got built. Nevertheless, and it remains today, as I understand it. I've never been to it.
Oh, yes.
Have you?
Yeah, well, you pay your 35
okay.
euro and you can go take a look at it. It's completely empty. I mean, there's absolutely nothing, other tourists.
But what was missing in your description was why the building is there. Well, surely it's a mistake to talk about any of the buildings we've talked about without talking about what problem they're setting out to solve, what the program was, and usually architects have to react to constraints. This is the thing that generates creativity in every aspect of design. And the Barcelona Pavilion was no different. We don't know what the instructions were, but surely that's an important thing to look into and consider when analyzing whether the building was a success. We're not. You're describing it as a sculpture, essentially.
Well, yes. I mean, when Mies was teaching, I'll give you another little tidbit. When Mies was teaching at IIT in Chicago, the first year and the first exercise students were confronted with was they had to draw 2 crossing lines, and they could, he wouldn't specify any, it could be 2 thin lines, 2 dotted lines, 2 thick lines, 1 thin, 1 thick. You come up with the thing. And somehow, in his mind, there was a correct solution to this problem. Or maybe he was trying to say to people, well, if you come up with the Barcelona Pavilion by doing basically these lines crossing, then, you're doing pretty good. And other than that, what this exercise, I remember my father telling me about, as if it was the greatest invention since sliced bread. And I thought, well, yeah, it's interesting.
That's very intriguing because my father, as you know, was an architect who went to the same school we did, McGill, graduated in 1948. And I think even in his last days, when I talked to him about his education at McGill, the thing that he talked about with the most pleasure was the drawing exercise that Gordon Weber assigned to him. Gordon Weber being an instructor at McGill who had been a pupil of Moholy Nagy, who was a master at the Bauhaus. And he described the exercise of arranging lines and circles on a piece of paper and having to do so 32 times and being unable to stop marveling at the endless but difficult decisions necessary to make something that looked right, if you ever did get to that final destination.
Well, that's right. But like you said before, an architect has thousands of constraints. One of the biggest constraints is gravity. The other one is water. And then the main constraint is that you have a client. Unfortunately, the client has lived in many houses, maybe some apartments, has been to cinemas, has been to a bank, has been pretty much to the whole built environment. They're familiar with that. Maybe they've even traveled, so they've seen, classical buildings and so on. So they have a baggage, whether you like it or not. Plus the fact that he's the one footing the bill. The constraints are enormous. Zoning, the site, the sun. I mean, you can, and thank God for that. There's nothing worse than staring, like somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, I just want a house with 3 bedrooms. Do whatever you want." Well, no, I can't do whatever I want. You must tell me something about yourself. How does your family function? I don't know. Maybe you've got 20 cars, so we have to accommodate the 20 cars. I don't know. I mean, you need the constraints. You can't just be told, well, the world's your canvas.
How can we wrap this up? What are some topics
Well,
that we need to discuss?
I think I am glad, for one, to have lived in an era where the Bauhaus had a big in a lot of things. I had a lot of furniture that was designed by these, certainly graphic design and certainly architecture, and not having to put doodads and to follow some kind of canon and the golden section and all this kind of stuff. So I'm glad, but I think what I'm really glad for is the freedom. The freedom that if I had any, I could really explore it and come up with something. I think that's their biggest legacy, is the freedom.
Of course, Bauhaus was a school. Its whole purpose was to educate. It sent people out into the world who were infused with those principles, and they changed the world as a result. And that is still happening, whether we want to admit it or not. I don't know, and perhaps you don't either, where the centers of revolutionary educational change are at the moment. Maybe there are none. Surely that will come up over and over again. I mean, that's the way that history works, is that these things repeat themselves. So education is something we need to talk about. We also need to talk about what constitutes great design, why you react the way you do to images that you see and buildings that you experience, and other examples of design, why I react generally the same way, why that should be. I think it'd be fruitful to talk about why certain design is great and others fall short. So let's do that on a future occasion and wrap this up for now. How's that sound?
Sounds great to me.